Okay, so I'm going to be talking about style, which I just kind of became very passionate about, and it's specifically we're going to be talking about the style elements library. So let's get into it. There was kind of after thinking about style for a few months and being oh, this feels like a little shaky part, it's that we still don't have a solid answer, at least in my mind, of what style means. And after thinking about it for a few months, it really kind of came into clarity of one question, which is where is your layout? And if you think about it for a moment and just let it sit with you, we can actually say where do you define your layout? And it's you can't point at one of these, and that's kind of a huge problem. Because layout affects itself. So in Elm, obviously, one of the great parts about it is we have these really nice first-class ideas. We can say what does my data look like? And we'd be oh yeah, look at our model. Boom, we got our data. Or we can say well, how does it change? And it's great, we have an update function. That's the only place it can change. And we're oh well, what code talks to the outside? And commands and subscriptions, and that's really cool. And then we're well, what's the layout? And we're well, our view generates HTML, which then we take layout mapped from CSS to HTML, and it just gets kind of muddy. But what's your priority when you're working on your view? Your priority likely isn't to make a semantic document. You want that idea to a certain degree because you want it to be machine readable, right? You want search engines to be able to find you. You want accessibility. You want those things, but it's not what you're doing. What you're doing is usually page layout and interactivity. And when I say page layout, it's specifically, I'm not just talking about Flexbox, right? I'm talking about the whole cohesive idea, your page that's laid out in a certain way. Where could I go to actually find that? And fixing page layout is one of the most frequent and irritating things in CSS/HTML because it's split across multiple areas. Adjusting layout usually means going across multiple files and multiple definitions by default. You can kind of see people trying to do inline styles, but that gets it's not necessarily super straightforward because we don't necessarily have any guarantees around it, but that's the desire is we want one single construct to actually say look, this is how things are laid out. And HTML and CSS basically imply by design that hierarchy and layout are they're totally independent. And for small things, you can kind of say that, but in many ways they're just not. Especially if you're thinking about layout as an entire page construct as opposed to just one element that lays out some children. So what you end up doing is you end up doing this kind of hierarchy dance. Where you have your node structure, and then you have a CSS selector, and then you have implied hierarchy in a lot of your CSS properties, where it's oh look, this property only acts this way if the parent is a thing, or if the children is a thing, and it's not explicit. And so what you have to do is you actually have to go back and forth between your structure and your CSS selectors, which there's a lot of recommendation to make them as short as possible to limit layout or to limit that hierarchy matching, and to use these in there's no single place to do this. And if you don't get those things to match up, if you don't match up your entire tree across multiple places, it breaks. But what does it mean to break in style? We don't have undefined is not a function in style. We have, but we can feel it's broken. We're oh man, that broke. And it's really, we have to kind of go a little higher. We have to say oh, an error in style is the unexpected. Anything that's unexpected, we kind of got to consider that an error. And that's a little bit of a loose definition, but it's kind of what we have to deal with. And so our only way to combat this is to have something consistent and explicit. So what I wanted to do with this library is I wanted to if I totally could, I wanted to make a new guarantee around style, right? It's like we have this awesome guarantee. We're like, if it compiles, no runtime exceptions. That's so cool. What does that mean for guarantee around style? It's like, well, if it compiles, the layout is fully explicit. That's actually something pretty real that we could do. So, if we have a single place for layout in your view, we don't need to do this kind of bizarre going back and forth between multiple files to actually do this. We just have one place for our layout, so it's very obvious when things interact in a certain way. Because it's like, well, it's right there. Of course it would do that because it's this. So, when we're talking about layout, it's not one of these properties. It's like all of these properties. Like they all affect each other. And they all require like your node hierarchy to interact in a certain way, right? And like plumbing the depths of how these things interact is why layout is like a huge pain. You can sort of think of these things as like they have side effects in your layout, right? So now that we have kind of like that idea, where can we go with it? So I made the style elements library, and basically there are two components to this thing. And you can't make unbreakable style, I think, without actually having these two components. So one of them is like your view, instead of just making HTML, we have this new construct called an element that essentially is like layout plus HTML, right? It's like HTML that always has a guaranteed idea of layout. And we'll get into like kind of what that means. But we also need a style library, which is basically kind of the opposite of that, which is you cannot have layout in your style sheet, or else you kind of break that contract. So now how would we actually build this thing? Well, we're going to need some new primitives. So these are pretty easy, right? We have a nothing, and we have some text. Great, nothing new. Now, here's kind of what I'm considering like the equivalent of a div, which you have divs like all over the place. This is the basic element, and it's just called element, but the key thing, well, first, it does have a style like identifier, and we'll kind of get into that later. But the key thing here is it only has exactly one child. Like if you think about it, if you have a div in normal HTML, you have a div and it has multiple children, there's exactly zero explicit contract that you have of how those children should be laid out. So that's actually, like in my mind, that's what I view as like the undefined is not a function error state, is div with some children. And it's like, that's so basic, why would you think of that as an error state? Except it's not explicit. What does it do? I don't know. So now that we have that, well, obviously we want things that have multiple children, right? Well, we can only do that if the layout is explicit. So, and this should feel like pretty straightforward, right? We have a row of stuff. That's great. Or we could have a column, or wrapped row, or wrapped column. The point here is we have a very explicit idea of kind of what's happening. Though it's not really enough just to have that. We need some more descriptors. So when I was looking at this problem, I was thinking okay, well, what if we just ignore CSS for the moment and say what are the ways that we would actually talk about how we would lay stuff out if we were talking to humans? And one of them is this idea of spacing. And it's a space between children. It's oddly enough very hard to express this without some very specific HTML and specific CSS. Fortunately, this library kind of does it in the background. You're able to say, look, I have a row, spacing is 20, and the padding is whatever. Alignment. Alignment is a key design term, right? It's kind of universal. It means something, and it's very human. People talk about alignment, and they don't talk about float left, right? They say align left, not float left. So we have this row. And look, we would just want it on the left, please. And this should work, and it does. And it's really nice because you know exactly kind of what's happening, and you need to make an adjustment. And you can actually assign the alignment to the individual elements as well. Now we can actually just take these basic constructs that we've already played around with, and we can make a nav bar, right, which we've all needed to do. Now, this should be super easy. And in this case, it's like, look, we have a row, and then we have an element. Oh, this row is justified, right? So it means things are on the two sides. We have an element on the right, which is our logo. We are golden square. And we have another row on the left, which has some spacing. It's like that's a basic construct, and the code is like representing that. It's really nice. And you might be thinking like, okay, well, this kind of just looks like syntactical sugar around Flexbox, right? Which is, at this point, true. But what I am going to show you is actually, it's a consistent vocabulary across all layouts. So a text layout. So text layout is interesting. This is actually code for block layout, but you didn't know that's really made for laying out text, and not much more. So when we want to lay out text, that's great. We have a text layout. What can we do in this text layout? Well, if we have a box in there and we align left, that's code for float left. And when I say code for float left, I don't mean like, it means like you don't need to worry about how it got over there. It's just like this is how this functions in a text layout. Spacing, it's the exact same concept, right? So we established like spacing 10. So that means the spacing between everything is 10. We could set the vertical and the like horizontal spacing independently if we wanted to, but like the idea like is there that we have this like high-level design control over what the layout's doing. So this is kind of where things kind of got like a little different. I was like, okay, well, we have this nav bar, and like I want to position something like below it, like some drop-down options. And so I'm like, well, okay, why don't I just like take that sentence and like turn it into code? And that's sort of what happened. Is you can actually just say like, look, you have this one element. Below this element, there's some stuff, and it renders kind of like as you'd expect, which is surprising. And we have different like positions, and I forgot one on here, but so you can position stuff above, below, on the right. You can do within, so if you wanted to be like in the middle, that'd be great. There's also screen that takes it and positions it relative to the screen, but I forgot to put it on there. Alignment still works again. So we have this like column, and we're below, and if you look, we went to the center, yay. So like all of a sudden we have this vocabulary, we can kind of like start like thinking about it. There's like not many concepts here, and layout honestly isn't that many concepts, but in CSS it's a massive number of concepts. So what would this look like, or what does it look like for grid? Because we want grids. Grids are still like a primal thing. Well, if we're defining a grid, I mean we need to define some stuff. So we need to define like the widths of our columns. So great. So we define some widths. We can either use pixels, % or fill. Fill just takes up a certain amount of space that's left over. And then we define some rows. Again, we can do that again, or same thing. And then we need to basically enforce that every thing on here is actually positioned like on the grid. So we say like, look, start at 0, 0, and like be like a certain width and a certain height. And it's pretty obvious. You never have something that's like not positioned, so you never like escape the system, and everything's like nice and explicit. We can also do a named grid, which is like essentially we can name areas. This is the same concept as like CSS templates, I believe, grid template something. And so if we do that, then we can actually render them not giving coordinates but giving like namespaces. I'm not actually entirely convinced that you'd want to do this versus the other one, but it's cool that they're both there. So now that we have like this like kind of cohesive idea of layout, which that's not very much, but you can almost imagine any app that you could lay out with those primitives. What would we need to do beyond layout? Because it's not just layout. Well, we need to be able to describe node names. Again, we want this machine-readable thing. We want search engines to be able to scan it. We want accessibility to be able to read the document. So in order to do that, basically we're able to annotate what nodes we need to actually annotate, and the rest of them we just don't care. So the next question is like responsiveness. And so if we buy into this idea that layout should live in the view, and we buy into the idea that responsiveness is mostly about layout, then it kind of follows that responsiveness should be in the view too, instead of having like some sort of map. Like how would it work otherwise? So we can actually just have a pretty simple function. We get a subscription to window size, and we transform it into basically, is it a phone, is it a tablet, is it whatever? And those are just like checking ranges for the thing, right? Now that we have all this like nice data, we can actually just like have our variance like directly here. Like, it turns out to be pretty nice. And you can actually, there's an advantage here that like if you also kind of buy into the idea that like layout will require a certain structure, and so structure needs to change depending on what layouts. Well, what if you have the situation where depending on if it's a phone, the structure would need to change? Well, in this case, you could do that because you already have the tool to like say like, oh yeah, go to this view if it's a phone or this view if it's not. We have to decide if that actually made sense or not, but you have the option. You don't have the option with media queries. So now let's say we're like, okay, great. We can like flip on things, flip them off. But like, what if we want something a little bit more involved? So we can have this function, which is actually a very pretty small function, and it could be actually called like map linear or like scale linearly or whatever. But essentially, we say like, look, responding to like the device width, when the device width is between 600 and 1200, set the value between 100 and 200, and map it linearly. Like that's generally what most of like media queries are doing. Right? So now that we've talked about layout and not layout, let's talk about like the style part of like style elements, because again, this goes with the idea that we're kind of presenting here. So this is what a style sheet looks like. It's massively simplified because honestly, who knows if you actually need the other stuff. So there's only one selector, which is basically this identifier, right? That could be code for like basically a CSS class, but you kind of don't need to think about that. It's a class, and you can have any property in here that's not layout, or that list of stuff that affects each other and affects layout. So what that means is that when you like pick up a style and drop it somewhere else, like nothing breaks. Like it'll change color. That is expected because there's one place that you could find kind of what's going on. But it's nice and resilient. And also there's the idea of basically one element, one style. So we're really like breaking it down. Sometimes though we want to actually have like a little bit of variation, I suppose. So let's, for example, I should have named that button. Let's say we had a style that was a button, and we wanted to have a variation that was like a disabled button. Well, we could set those as like separate styles, and like that would be reasonable. But at the same time, we could actually have like a variation, and this actually works really well if you have variations that are like similar variations across different things. So like if you had disabled, if it applied to multiple different styles, then you could actually define this variation for the different styles, and then render it actually in your view where you say like, look, I have a button, in this case it's called my style, and then we like flip on the disabled switch. And it just does kind of what you expect. As far as like actually rendering this stuff, it can be really nice to actually have some protection against foreign styles, right? So if you had some other style sheet that actually would have a clash with the name that you're generating, that would again create this kind of mysterious effect where it's like, what's going on here? So by default, the styles are actually guarded by a hash of the properties that are actually contained in there. Yeah, you can turn that off if you really need to, but I would not recommend it. So, like with this whole idea, with Elm, there's this like Elm refactoring is awesome. It's one of the main reasons that I love Elm. I can come in, I can add a feature, I can go take a vacation. So with style, we don't have that. It's like you change something and you check it out and you're like, okay, and then you miss a media query or something, and you track down kind of where everything's happening, and it's kind of a mess. But what I found is like style refactoring, when you have explicitly fully styled or fully specified layout, turns out to be like really nice, because all the information you need to actually make like a design decision is right there. Like there's no hidden like effect coming from some other file. And yeah, if you want to check it out and try using something that basically doesn't require you to know CSS, come here. Come to this Elm Slack channel on style elements if you want to like talk about it more, or you have like more questions beyond whatever questions show up. And that's it.